Welcome to It's a Privilege podcast, where we explore the possibilities of our privilege. This is part one on the privilege of travel. We have two special guests today. They are passionate Rotarians, pilots, and advocates to end polio. One is a mental health professional who has led natural disaster efforts, and the other is a U.S. military veteran with an International Service Award. We have Tien and John Ockenfels. I also have the privilege of having two wonderful co-hosts. We have James Tierney, a private tutor, academic coach, improviser, and co-founder of Happy Valley Improv. We also have Don Rosenbaum, a non-binary healthcare professional and improv director. What can you expect in this episode? First, our crew is going to chat and explore the privilege of travel. And then we'll get into the privileged perspective with the two pilots and hear a story about how travel has impacted their lives. To get us started, let's check in on our own privilege.
It's great to be here. Super excited. I'm in a good mood.
You're in a good mood?
I'm in a great mood.
Okay, perfect. All right, we start the episode off every single time in the same way. Every day might be different, but what is one privilege that you're feeling today? Let's start with you, Dawn.
A privilege that I had today, I did not have to worry about my house today. I was able to go to work.
Oh.
I sort of touch base, literally, partner. I was like, tag, you're it. And then I also left again to come do this. So as a person who lives a busy lifestyle, I don't got to really worry about, is my laundry getting done? Is my house clean? Are my dishes done? Do I have dinner? I don't worry about any of that.
So not only home, but laundry is also being completed for you.
If I need it to be, yeah. I have an equal partnership with my romantic partner. So because of that, we manage the house together. And so I'm feeling that privilege to be able to be here with you guys today.
Nice. I'll be handing off my laundry to you. James, what about you? What is one privilege you're feeling today?
I mean, I have the exact same one, but now I can't.
No,
it's like when you go out to dinner, you can't order the same thing.
You cannot order the same thing.
Someone else.
You'll instantly be kicked off the podcast. If
I figured as much. I think a privilege that I experienced today was the ability to communicate well. And for my day job as an educator and a coach and a tutor, I had an initial consultation with a new incoming first-year student and her mom, and I have the ability to communicate and connect with people, and that made it so that way I made the sale. Not everyone.
You made some sales, you made some new friends.
Heck yeah.
Well, there you go. And for me, the privilege that I have is, of course, just being here with you. And I can do that because this is my podcast. Before we hop into our first segment with the privileged perspective, how does travel relate to both of you? And how is that related to privilege? Let's start with you, James.
I love traveling domestically and internationally, but I don't travel internationally as much. I like to just get out and experience new things. That's how it kind of connects to me personally. Learning about the history, figuring out and finding out how certain cities or areas have become what they are now. And not everyone gets that opportunity to not only experience the travel, but even learn about it.
But why is that something that interests you? Like, when you get to travel, what piques the James Tierney in you?
I like to learn about how it came about. So, for example, my wife and I just got back from traveling to Barcelona, and one of the things that we did was almost every day went on some sort of walking tour to learn about the history and the individuals and groups of people who made it the way it is now. So that's what I really like about it.
As an educator, that seems very fitting.
Yes.
What about you, Dawn? How does travel relate to you, especially from a privileged perspective?
So I've had a moderate amount of travel in my life. In the last few years, I've tried to make it a priority to do so. Two things about me that I feel are really part of my upbringing was, one is I come from a town that's incredibly transitional. Everybody's coming in and out and coming from different perspectives and cultures. And the idea that I would sort of stay stationary where I live has never been something I expected to do. So I usually travel as part of my own experience to be able to learn about those cultures, as James said. Also, I'm adopted. I have a lot of siblings from a lot of backgrounds. I grew up in a very multicultural type of family. And so traveling allows me to be able to embrace different other people's cultural heritage. And a lot of times it's been a really great opportunity for me to be able to just sort of meet new people, see how, and learn about other cultures and appreciate them.
It sounds like you had a diversity within your own household.
Mm-hmm.
But what was one moment when you were younger when you got to go outside of your bubble and see something else and you're like, yo, that's different?
The first time that I ever got to travel, before this, we had only like driven up and down the East Coast of North America, and we stayed in the United States. So for me to actually be able to get on a plane and go somewhere, the first time ever was actually in college. I took an opportunity and went to Ireland. And I was like, Ireland. Yeah, I'm, for those people who can see, a redheaded, fair-skinned, freckled individual. So I tend to blend in a lot when it comes to when people think of Irish culture. But when I went there, it was, you're thinking, oh, they also speak English. No, complete culture shock in a really good way, in my opinion, being able to explore how did Ireland come about? And then I got to learn what the word meet means, like to meet someone.
In my mind, I had so many different definitions of meat.
Yeah,
I was like,
you're
well,
like
hamburger, bacon.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
A friend of mine had done a study at the University of Limerick. So we went there and we saw a bunch of friends that she had gone to school with.
Yeah.
And they were all talking about, oh, yeah, so-and-so met with so-and-so and so-and-so met with so-and-so. And I was like, wow, I thought these people knew each other really well. Well, that's when I got to find out that to meet means to make out with in Ireland.
Oh.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, they know each other really well.
So question
Exact
about
opposite.
this.
Yeah.
If you have to go to a meeting,
What
how
is
many
that?
people are involved
Right?
in that situation?
I was concerned myself,
Right.
but I did learn that night that at least in the college snapshot of the people in University of Limerick, it was incredibly common to go to a bar. Now this was New Year's Eve, but to go to a bar and meet with a bunch of people and then go home. And I was known as the most prudish American they'd ever met, according to them, because I was like, no, I'm not making out with
No, thank you. That's not what I signed up for.
Yeah.
Sounds like a meat pie, if you ask me.
I see what you did there.
I see what you did there. Actually, meat pies are really delicious out in Australia. I never really had a meat pie. I thought it sounded weird, but until I had one, I was like, no, this is actually fairly delicious. The first time that Dawn really remembers traveling is defined by going outside of the country. But what's one moment you remember traveling that was not outside the country, that was significant for you when you were younger?
It would have been 9th grade.
You knew exactly what it was.
Yeah.
I know exactly what it was because I grew up 2 younger siblings. My parents didn't have a lot of money and grew up in a very small rural town. And the people who got to go on airplanes and travel places, I viewed as having more resources and having more money than us. And in 9th grade, my grandparents used to be snowbirds, and they would go down to Florida from upstate New York for the winter. And for spring break in 9th grade, I got the opportunity to go down to Florida and spend the week with them and then drive back up with them. And I told everyone that I could because I didn't want to be the poor kid who lived in the crappy house that was never clean. I wanted to fit in more. So when I got that opportunity, I was like, oh yeah, I go to Florida for spring break. So that's like the first real, I guess, travel.
It was almost like a name drop of traveling. Like,
Oh yeah, exactly.
go to Florida for spring break.
Travel, I find it fascinating that the moment that was most memorable for you had to involve other people's perception of you traveling, not you experiencing something.
Have you met me, Jason?
Yeah, I understand, but like
I run an improv. All I care about are people and their views of me.
But I don't think that's an uncommon thought process. I don't think what you're expressing is different than a lot of people. As using travel can be just like getting a new pair of shoes or getting an award some way. It fits in my mind. It was like, oh, there are all these things that exist that you can experience and the learning and da-da. And you're just like, listen, I could tell my friends. So what was the first time you traveled somewhere and you're like, oh, I don't need to, that you did it for yourself and it wasn't about somebody else or you got some benefit out of it?
Has it happened yet?
I mean, I do take trips for myself. Like if I go to Las Vegas a lot and I enjoy going to Las Vegas. That's always for me. And I don't want to be like, hey, everyone, I'm going to Las Vegas to gamble all this money. That's not cool. I mean, it's cool to some people, but not for a lot of people.
So wait, even that you don't share the information now because of people's perceptions.
That's probably
of you.
true.
Oh, wow.
That's probably true.
It's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
No, but if you think of like most of the travel I've done here in the U.S., it's usually for conferences. Kim and I, my wife and I, we traveled to all 30 baseball stadiums. We did a road trip over 62 days. So that was a big travel. That was for me, but it was also for my wife.
When it comes to travel, I feel like it's such an interesting thing that travel truly is, to me, an opportunity or a privilege because it's not something that's known for being cheap. And I think there is certainly there is a step between, hey, I traveled to something I can walk to or bike to versus something I can drive less than a half hour to versus your classic American road trip, which takes time, but is still the car. And then the next step being like plane. And now in America, we've got trains, which are known for being inefficient, and yet you can pay a lot of money to sit luxuriously in your inefficient travel just so you don't have to drive. You can watch the scenery as it goes by. Does it take a long time? Yes, it does. Like, it's become a thing that you do. And I can see why for James, it's like, I can say I traveled here because we know that is something that's somewhat envious when it comes to social status because of the cost.
I find it fascinating just how expensive train rides are.
Right?
I would feel like it should be really inexpensive for me to hop onto a train and travel to, I don't know, Detroit.
Yes.
Because in other countries, like when I was in India, the trains are super cheap, but you are also, the cheapest tickets are also on trains in which there's no air conditioning and there are no tickets, so they can be packed full of people, but you can get a train ticket from one part of the country to another for a couple dollars. And the most uncomfortable thing is, like, for me, when I went there, I chose not to get that ticket because I was like, I don't know how busy it's going to be. I was a little nervous, so I had the privilege of paying for the higher level ticket and having my own little seat on the train. But here in the United States, I feel like it's the same cost sometimes as buying a plane ticket.
Yep.
Why?
Yep.
Why? Doesn't make sense to me.
I used to take train up to Massachusetts where I was living at the time from Pennsylvania when I would visit family. And I remember I was looking at the train. They say these things take forever and it's long. No, we're good. We stopped for 20 minutes in one, I think it was DC. We stopped for another 25 minutes, just intentionally stopped for like 35 minutes in New York City. And then they stopped for a whole hour. I forget where it was, but it was like right before my stop. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And it was 10 and a half hours for a trip. It takes like a car 8. So it was just, why? It's expensive and it takes a long time.
It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
Before we hop into seeing the privileged perspective, do you know anybody who in your hometown, from your hometown growing up, that hasn't traveled pretty much outside of that town? Like, what do you think that impact was for them?
Yeah, there's plenty of people in my hometown who rarely, if ever, travel. Now, I live on the Canadian border, so even those that maybe have only traveled 10 to 20 miles outside of our hometown have still most likely have traveled internationally.
Interesting.
And experienced something completely different, since it is Quebec with the French Canadian language, etc. But there are a lot of people in my hometown who have either chosen, or like you said, life has created the situation of not a lot, if any, travel.
Does travel matter? Like, is it necessary to interact with others, or is it just like this benefit that we get to do because it's expensive?
I don't necessarily believe that it's a necessity to travel. I think there's a necessity for community and to connect with people, even if it's in a small community. I think there are lots of benefits of learning of other cultures and experiencing that and recognizing that people who don't look or live like you are still other people and the humanity of it all. But I don't know if I would go as far as say that it is a necessity.
So I do have people in my town, and there is a very specific weird thing that happens that I've noticed as a trend for the people who are not well traveled in my town, who've never left my town. Because my town is a college town, there is a us and them mantra that tends to develop of the people who in the town that stay in the town and the people that come use the town for its educational resources and then leave. And because of that, I've learned that there's more xenophobia for the people who have never left here. They sort of feel like they will make comments that show that they are not as open-minded to new cultures, new people, new backgrounds, new experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them will actually avoid anything that has to do with any kind of collegiate activities just so that they sort of, it's a weird pride of like, nah, I'm not a part of the collegiate part. I'm a part of the town part.
Yeah.
To answer your other question about is it essential, I think that one of the correlations I've noticed is well-traveled people tend to have more empathy for people of different walks of life, perspectives, cultures, etc. So I don't find that travel is essential to every human being, but I do find it to be a phenomenal gateway to empathy.
Before we head to the privileged perspective, there's one final thought I have on that. It's interesting to hear both perspectives, that it's possible that traveling is not necessary for us to be productive human beings, to communicate and interact with other people. At the same time, you're also suggesting that it's possible that by limiting one's perspective, we might be shouting to the choir or become insulated to our own thoughts. And it's interesting to say that, like, is that a bad thing? No, maybe not. But could it be? Maybe so. So depending on the person, depending on where you're coming from, will also impact just how beneficial travel could be to the human being that is there. So let's dig into that in just a little bit. But first, let's hop into the privileged perspective and see what these two pilots have to say.
At 4 o'clock in the morning or 4:30 in the morning on the end of the runway in Pongo Pongo, looking down the brightly colored lights of that runway, seeing nothing but a couple of white lights over on the side of the hill, and everything else was black on black on black, and then pushing the throttle forward as we advanced to start that 18-hour flight. And for the next 6 hours, it was dark and cloudy. And as you push that throttle forward, I still remember thinking, we're going to make it. We're going to make it. And so that, to me, was the commitment of the entire flight, was that one takeoff, because that was the longest one. How many people in the world would have ever thought to fly an airplane around the world, to do that thing that everybody dreams of doing, the Walter Mitty dream, go someplace, be somebody, do something. I had that experience. Peter Tien, sitting here with me, asked me to join him on a flight around the world. And it took me some time to process that and to figure out what was going on, because it was such a big deal to me that I was afraid to say yes. And when you think about that, you're going to fly an airplane around the world. We're going to go across the ocean in a single engine airplane. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, I think in the background is 702 pilots in history have flown a single engine airplane around the world. There's only 268 of us alive in the world today. And this is a flight was about being battered over the head and everything telling us not to do it. Literally, from 2 years of COVID having to cancel, and then our route originally taking us up to Russia. So in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. We had to cancel because they wouldn't allow us in their airspace. And through all those hurdles, we got to that point when Russia invaded that saying, we have to give up our dream, because the only way around is the dangerous route through Australia, which only 30 pilots in history have gone that far to get around the world all the way down to Australia.
If either one of us would have said, well, maybe we would have been done. But neither one of us was willing to accept that. And we kept trying to find a way around it, which in some cases it was outright denial. Yeah, we can do this. Yeah, we can do this. Yeah. So, story of the flight.
One of our favorite quotes that we show or tell people is, people will tell us it couldn't be done, shouldn't be done, and only crazy people would do this. And yet we probably was defined by many in all three of those categories that shouldn't, and we're probably crazy. But when you truly dream something and know it's the best thing to serve others, you do it. You figure out how to do it. You don't throw it in and say, I can't do it. You figure out how to do it.
This started off as Peter wanting to fly his airplane around the world. And he eventually asked me to join him so that there would be some extra security there. And I also have some talents. But as we did this, it was never intended to be a flight to talk about polio or to raise money for polio or to raise awareness about the necessity to eliminate polio. It was always intended to be a flight of the two of us just enjoying going around the world. As we decided that we're going to make it a fundraiser for something, that was in the background. Okay, let's make it polio. We're both in Rotary, that'll work. Over the course of the few years that drug on as we were being shut down 3 different times, polio got to be a bigger deal in the flight. The concept, the number one concept overriding everything was always still the same. Fly safe, come home alive. But let's see what we can do to raise awareness for polio. That pretty soon became the driving force of the flight.
I was went down to his hangar. We sat down and looked at each other and said, the one thing we haven't discussed is what are we doing with this flight? And we both, the light went off, I think, at that point, that we decided that it was against our beings to say, we're just going to have fun flying around the world. The light went off. I remember distinctly that we have to do something meaningful to make this flight worthwhile.
Well, the one thing we have in common, we're both Rotarians, okay? And I've been very active in polio eradication program since I joined Rotary in 1986. But I just looked at Peter and I remember saying, well, why don't we just do it for polio since we're both Rotarians? And about 30 seconds later, it was a done deal. We were doing it for polio.
When we originally talked about this, we looked at each other and said, we're two old farts going to fly around the world. How much of an impact did we have?
It was the support of our Rotarians around the world that made this flight happen. They stayed with us through the entire thing. When Peter was sick, it was Rotarians in those individual towns that made sure that he was taken care of while he was in the hospital, while I moved on to another city where we had more engagements to keep those from having to cancel.
You know, people scratched their heads and said, you guys will never do it. I remember working in the ghettos of Karachi, Pakistan, where the leadership team there said, a lot of people say they're coming to Karachi, Pakistan, and never come. We were surprised last week that you were coming, and we had to get ready.
And they knew about it for 2 years.
They knew about it for 2 years, but that's the strength of and that's probably a privilege, having that kind of strength of dream.
One of the benefits of this is that we've been able to share current factual information about the people living in Afghanistan and Pakistan and their fight against polio. For years, people have been talking about the fact that in Pakistan and Afghanistan in particular, roving bands of marauders have been attacking the caregivers doing the polio drops because they've been opposed to the vaccinations. In fact, a number of these ladies, and it's always ladies, by the way, were killed over the last few years. Well, starting a short time ago, the government, the religious leaders, everybody had a change and decided that vaccinations were a great thing. They got on board with the program, told everybody to allow it to happen. And so now, when we were in the ghettos, and these are the refugees from Afghanistan in the ghettos in Pakistan, in Karachi, in several cases, it was the dads that brought the kids out to be vaccinated, which is another stereotype that had to be changed, because the stereotype is that the dads never take care of the kids, only the moms. And yet we had the photographs showing several times. And I saw the same thing when we did it in Chennai and a couple other places that we did some vaccinations.
But it wasn't necessarily easy on many parts of this
but I mean,
trip.
to make the decision.
To make the decision, yeah. And I remember as we were moving around in Karachi, 2 Americans in the newspaper, in the news, going down into some dangerous parts of the city. And we were in a police vehicle, escorted by 2 police vehicles, lights and sirens. Behind us were 2 trucks of Pakistani Army Rangers. And when we got out of our police vehicle, 1 truckload of soldiers surrounded John, and the other surrounded me to make sure that we were being protected.
We didn't stand out.
We didn't stand out at all. I think we would have felt safe without the guards, simply because we believe so much in the mission.
The reality of it is we spent years planning, getting all this stuff down and changing plans and modifying plans and getting ready to go. We finally got ready to go. And on the second day, all those plans went out the window, because at the end of the first day, as we were landing in New Hampshire, we lost our primary alternator on the airplane. The electrical system of the airplane was failing. And it took us almost a week to get parts in, to get that fixed and get going again. And we're on our way to Canada, feeling pretty darn good at this point. And all of a sudden we're running into a huge ice and snowstorm over our destination. We had to divert to another town and land, stay there for a few more days. Finally got to our original destination of Goose Bay, and more ice and snow. By the time we got out of there and heading over to Europe, We went from Canada direct to Reykjavik, Iceland. But by the time we got to Wick, Scotland, we were 10 days behind schedule and just getting started with the most important part of the visiting part of the trip. So we had to make some modifications. I think one of our friends put it very succinctly when she said, you had no problems at all other than mechanical, meteorological, and medical. Other than that, we didn't have any issues.
As we looked at our privilege of growing up and coming from poor families, both of us came from poor families. I think our whole life of growing up to now we're in our 70s prepared us so well for this trip. And I think the experience of this trip would have been completely different had we had not had the life experiences of you with a big family and being in the military and being in Thailand, or me, coming from with my disaster background, where I've been held at gunpoint by terrorists. I've seen lives completely destroyed and the horrors of disasters and the hardships of the people we were serving. I think all of those set us point where we could take our life experiences and serve others in this trip, where had it been the first time for either one of us in these environments,
It'd be eye-opening.
It'd be eye-opening, and I don't think we would have been so successful. I think we would have been overwhelmed.
There was never an incident on any place we went with any of the people we met that was negative from the standpoint of, well, we don't want to associate with those folks, or they don't want to associate with us. The opportunities that we had were so positive and so well received. That in itself was unusual. We didn't have anybody trying to tell us to go home. We didn't have anybody trying to tell us we shouldn't be there. And that was very uplifting. I was never at a point where I was afraid for my life from the people we were with. I had about 3,500 hours flying time in a Cessna 210 and about 25 hours in your airplane, I think. And now we're going to load this thing up. We're going to turn it into the airplane that's never intended to be flown off the ground, quite literally, because the maximum allowable weight in a Cessna 210 is 3,800 pounds. And when we took off on that final flight, we were well over 4,800 pounds. But that's okay. Even though it's against the laws of gravity, we had a federal permit that allowed us to do that. And basically, it was an experimental flight on a one-time ferry permit. Is this really true? We had to get all kinds of permits and modifications to the airplane. And we weren't really sure if we could carry that much weight very easily. And it turned out that we were correct. It was really difficult to fly. It was not stable at all for the first couple hours of each flight. So yeah, it was a challenge. As we were leaving Germany and we were heading for Greece by way of Italy, and we're climbing out of Germany. They wanted us to climb to 15,000 feet. And I'm climbing up. This, as we mentioned a little while ago, this airplane is unstable the first couple hours of flying time because of the weight. I'm talking to the controllers. We're cleared to 11,000 feet coming out of Germany. Finally got there. They told me to go to 13,000 feet as we're approaching the Alps, approaching the mountains. Went to 13,000 feet. And by now we're picking up some ice and some other issues. Very turbulent. We're really bouncing all over the place there for a little bit, up mountain waves. And he cleared me to 15,000. And because of some fuel issues, some fuel control issues, I could not get the power I needed to climb to 15,000 feet. And in the meantime, I can see the clouds, I can see the mountains occasionally, and we're bouncing all over the place. And I finally had to call the controller and say, I can't do this. And I knew there was higher mountains ahead of us. The controller just said, go back to 13,000 feet, which we could do. And then they just directed us around the mountains. And I still remember flying around some of those mountains at 13,000 feet. And they were definitely less than 1,000 feet below us and still getting taller as we're going around them. And that was one of those times when it really got my attention as to, holy God, what are we doing? And then we got through those mountain areas and life was grand again.
I think back often about my darkest fear, or the moment when I knew we shouldn't be doing this, we should have never taken off today. I was on this very long 17-hour flight from Pago Pago, America Samoa to Hawaii. We took off at 4:30 in the morning. It was dark. We flew around the edge of a mountain and instantly lost communication with mankind. And for the next 17 hours, neither one of us had communication with the outside world. Nobody knew where we were at. I was sending up text messages every 15 minutes, hoping that somebody would get off satellites where we were at. So we went down. They might find some wreckage at that point. It was going to be a long day. We weren't going to make it till Hawaii till 11 o'clock at night. Storms were in the forecast. We went in and out of a few showers. It was about 13 hours into the flight. I remember sitting there. We had just come through a bouncy, turbulent storm. John turns to me and said, "Peter, we have a problem." And of all the 90 days, those few words, "Peter, we have a problem," was not what I wanted to hear at that moment. And my blood pressure jumped up. I started to sweat just hearing those words. And I said, "What's the problem?" And he said,
"We're doing some calculations, and I think we're going to be about an hour and a half short of getting to Honolulu on the gas. And I don't know why yet." We had done a lot of planning. We knew we had 2 hours minimum of 2 hours reserved when we were going to land at Honolulu.
There's nowhere else to land except in the ocean. It was going to be at nighttime. It would be a very tough emergency landing. I'm thinking I'll never see my wife and my kids again. I'm just trying to figure out, how do we stretch this fuel?
And so we had a ferry tank in the back, 160-gallon rubber bladder of gasoline behind our seat. And we would transfer that gas up to the top wing of the airplane. And that's how they got to the engine. And every time that tank would get low, we'd put more gas in it. And then we'd write it down in a little notebook. I was keeping track of the notebook, and Peter was handling the gas transfer. And so somewhere along the line, I wrote down the number 23 gallons, or was it 32? 32 gallons, yeah, twice on the same fill. And so had shorted ourselves just over 2 hours of flying time. And once we figured that out, and I took that 32-gallon dump out of there, all of a sudden we magically had 2.5 gallons or 2.5 hours of reserve when we landed.
And so when we finally got the voice of the controller 60 miles outside Hawaii, we had already figured out we were going to have enough gas, but we were thinking, we made one bad calculation, could there be a second? And until I'm on the ground in Hawaii, then I'll celebrate and be able to really take my last final breath of that day and relax.
I think we may have set a record, by the way, for the longest flight, because nobody that I'm aware of has flown a single engine airplane from Pongo Pongo all the way to Honolulu.
I think it really helps define who we were. I think it's part of one of those defining moments of the flight, because in that 45 minutes or an hour, really define our character.
During all these trials, tribulations, and there really were mechanical issues, meteorological issues, and medical issues on this flight, we never really panicked. We got concerned a couple times, but there's not a point at which we fell apart and we're not able to make decisions and think through the process. How do we solve it? How do we keep going? What's next? And I think that's really what defines the success of the flight. You got to do these things if you're going to do this. If you're going to launch into something like this, to have the capability to make decisions and figure out an alternative. When we got ready to take off, leaving Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the day we left Cedar Rapids, we had already raised $300,000, which with the Gates match brought it over $1 million. And so that was what we departed with. As we went around the world and that continued, we were telling people that we've already raised $1 million. As we got further around, we start seeing what's going on, and we start telling people we're raising almost $2 million. It's blown me away to be able to sit here and tell you right now, according to what we found out, this reflected so well with Rotary that they can actually see the bump in the financial impact of the polio eradication fundraising. We've raised over $2 million for the Gates match, which means we've raised over $700,000 of actual cash.
It hasn't sunk in. I'm still in awe of how we have motivated people to get involved and to buy into our dream. And that dream is a long ways from being over.
And that's where we're going to end part 1 on the privilege of travel. Come back in our next episode where we discuss the story you just heard and dive even deeper with the 2 pilots with the Q8P questions, answers, and privilege. In the meantime, go to our social media at PrivilegePod on all platforms and let us know your thoughts about how privilege of travel might impact your life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. And of course, it's a privilege.